We'll move on to the main business of this evening, which is to debate the motion, this House would apply to the Queen and country. And in proposition, we have Lieutenant General Brimms, and we also have Tim Lawson-Christian. And in opposition, we have Mr. Hercule Bra and Mr. Steve Bell. So I'll now invite Lieutenant General Brimms to open the case for the proposition. Thank you.
President, members, thank you very much for the opportunity for allowing me to propose this important debate. The British Army are great enthusiastic followers of the Blackadder series. I don't know if you remember the World War I Blackadder, where Captain Blackadder is sent to the field hospital to find the German spy, Operation Winkle. And in the process, he meets a nurse, Nurse Fletcher Brown, as she'll apparently become more clearly. He did a number of other things, but he certainly interviewed her, and he established that she had a girlfriend in England, and he put it to her that she had a boyfriend in England. He only got 2 modern then. He tested her. He said, the boyfriend obviously went to one of the great British universities, Oxford, Cambridge, or Hull. And when he came back to General Melchett, and he laid out his case, that I knew she was lying because I put her that her boyfriend went to one of the 3 great British universities, to which General Melchett said, "Of course she's lying. There are only 2. Oxford's a dump." It was indeed at that dump that this motion, the other way round, that under no circumstances would we fight for king and country. And that motion was passed by 275 votes to 153. That was in 1933. And it's worth reflecting on what the circumstances of 1933 were. The Great War, as it was called then, was horrific. And the horrors of the Great War were there for people to see in their everyday lives, with people missing limbs, eyes, and so forth. It was visible and it was raw. It was called the War to End All Wars. From it, the League of Nations was formed, and the League of Nations would regulate the world. And in the 1930s, there was a deep recession. So deep that it became a depression. And if you want to know that, it's deeper than a double dip. And there were political experiments of new political systems. Communism, fascism, the rise of dictators, nationalism. And in Britain, we had a 10-year moratorium on defence spending. And the reactions. The appeasers encouraged the dictators. The realists recognised that the peaceniks were the very enemies of peace. The pacifists were the enemies of peace. The British Army in the 1930s suffered from those consequences from 1939 to 1942. My father was adjutant of a territorial army battalion of the Allied Battalion of the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers at the time, 1939. He had been at Oxford in 1933. He always assured me he never went to this particular debate. But in 1939, he went to war, and they were a machine gun battalion. And you're probably all too young to remember, but in the days of football in those days, you used to have a rattle. It was a clacker, a wooden clacker that made a noise. They didn't have ammunition for their machine guns, they had clackers. The Germans weren't that impressed. The whole division surrendered, and he spent the next 5 years as a prisoner of war. So who were these people who made that vote in 1933? Actually, most of them joined up, and most of them fought for their country during what then became known as World War II. And many of them were killed, captured, and had their own stories to tell. So let us look today and consider the balance sheet. Let's look at this decade, the last 10 years. 9/11, the advent of Osama bin Laden, Afghanistan, Iraq, all with their own controversies. The United Nations. Has the United Nations been any better than the League of Nations? Bosnia. Were the United Nations effective in Bosnia? They weren't up to 1995, and then NATO took over. Kosovo. I don't recall the United Nations resolution. Afghanistan was a success. Iraq, there's been plenty of controversies. We have a recession. We've had a defence review in the last few months. Significant cuts. Do you know that the reduction in the defence budget announced last autumn is the same as the rise in the overseas development spending budget? And I wonder if that's a really wise, and are we actually checking and holding government to account in the wisdom and the effectiveness of the spending of the overseas defence budget? Tony Blair's cabinet, or his lack of cabinet, compare the Prime Minister, him, to the cabinet of 1936, 1938, 1939, 1940. There are some uncomfortable similarities. And who's been to see the King's speech? Nobody? Oh, a few. A lot of us just now. Listen to the King's speech. There are a few omissions. The word Germany is never mentioned. Now, it may be because he stuttered on Germany, but I don't think so. It might have been because actually to do with his own forebears. But Germany is never mentioned. The legal case for going to war was never mentioned. What was said was, it's the right thing to do. It was after the invasion of Poland. There was a bilateral arrangement between Britain and Poland. Mind you, there'd been a bilateral arrangement between Britain and Czechoslovakia, but that one didn't create the start of the war. And more widely, has President Obama apologised enough for US foreign policy? Or has he already apologised too much? And do people think that he is an appeaser and they're going to take advantage of him? Or as one of our members of Parliament, and he still is a member of Parliament in the current Parliament, when the IRA ceasefire broke down in the 1990s, he said, the genie's out the bottle, you know. So what lies ahead? What do we need to plan for? And what are we leaving behind? And let's just have a little look at the last few days. Less than a week ago, bombs in Moscow, probably coming from Islamic extremists. The ongoing Palestine-Israel settlement discussions and the revelations on WikiLeaks. Tunisia, Egypt right now. Yemen next, Algeria, Syria, Gaza, Saudi Arabia. And what about those nuclear powers that are rogue states? Iran and North Korea. Or what about a nuclear power losing control and becoming a failed state? Pakistan. Or what about the periphery of the Eurozone? Greece, Portugal, Ireland. And remember what the European community was first formed for. It was to stop Europe fighting. And the communist cause of fighting is for power. It's for power, for control of resource. And those are the knowns of this week. And what about, as Donald Rumsfeld said, what about the unknowns that are going to come and surprise us? So we're going to get surprised. So what sort of country do you think you want to be in? Do you want one that goes into isolation, has no place on the world stage, that lets others take the lead, and we become effectively the new fourth world? Or do you want to keep our place on the world stage? Do you want us to accept our history and our responsibilities, and to accept that the genie does get out of the bottle, and demand that we have leaders who confront the genie of violence? What sort of person are you? Are you fashionable, gullible, and wimpish? Or are you an analytical realist with the moral courage to do the right thing and stand shoulder to shoulder with your sovereign and indeed those troops doing the business today? The choice is yours. Thank you for your attention.